Hey, Rick.
Hey, how's it going? That was
Hi.
abrupt. Music was just
I
so
know.
calm.
Well, it's too many buttons to push. You'd think we'd get better at this, but it's hard. It's hard to push all these buttons. But that's okay. It's all right if we're rough every now and then. You're on a bridge. I was afraid you were going to fall off.
I was looking for somewhere risky to do this event.
So, hi, I'm Ann Merchant, and I'm with the National Academy of Sciences.
I'm Rick Lovert. I run the Science and Entertainment Exchange, which is a program of the National Academy of Sciences.
And welcome. We are very glad that you are here with us for Risky Business, which is the science of risk perception. We often do events around this time of year that are a little bit themed around this kind of thing, sort of some scary things, although it's been scary enough this year, so we didn't want to go too close to the edge. But we thought that this would be sort of an interesting, not so much a walk on the wild side, a walk on the risky-ish side, which we thought would be kind of fun. And so we'll start the way we always do, which is to at least describe for you a little bit about what the National Academy of Sciences is and does, and then segue over to Rick, who will talk about the exchange. But the National Academy of Sciences is a private nonprofit institution in Washington, D.C. that was founded, and I bet at this point I could sort of point to all of you and say, founded by whom? And then you would all shout back to me in unison, by Abraham Lincoln, because you probably know this by now. But if there are any of you who are new to our events, you would probably then say, wow, Abraham Lincoln, I didn't know that. And so we're very proud of that fact. And we always like to point it out because for us, it's a big deal. And of course, saying that it's founded by Abraham Lincoln sort of mires us in the past, but we're very relevant today and we're doing a lot of things. I was looking on our website, and I always do that before our events to check in on what's new and what's happening. And so today we released 3 things of note. One is, and you're going to see my eyes slide over because I have to make sure that I'm looking at my notes to get this right. We released Understanding the Well-Being of LGBTQI populations, where our Division on Behavioral and Social Sciences and Education looked at the way in which these populations are at risk and their well-being is at risk, either legally, through the health system, through various ways in which they can be put at risk. So the science is very clear on these things, and we have a whole committee that's looked at that. We also just released the summary of a 2-day virtual workshop on the airborne transmission of COVID-19. And this brought together virologists and engineers and public health officials. So you can download that from our website and go look at that summary. We also, with the election in full swing, we had a committee in 2018 that looked at the ways in which safe voting could take place. And so that committee, it was sort of a bring the gang back together, and we had them pull together a workshop where we could look at the ways in which voting could take place safely. And so there's a video workshop on, will our votes be counted and will it be safe? So I think that's very relevant. And you can see the sort of breadth of the work that is taking place at the institution. So Sachi has very nicely put in the chat for you to see where you can find those links. So Abraham Lincoln kicked us off in 1863, but we're still going strong. And of course, we want to make this work relevant and accessible to people who might not be interested in reading 400-page reports, because that's sort of our stock and trade. But that's why we created the Science and Entertainment Exchange. And Rick, as you said, you are the director of that program, and you can describe what it is that we do.
Yeah, so if you're a storyteller, writer, producer, actor, studio executive, you have a question about science as you're making a feature film, TV show, video game, media product, you can give us a call at 844-NEED-SCI, and I or Sachi will connect you with a scientist who can hopefully answer your question and put it in some context. We've done over 320 or 3,200, that's a lot more, consults since we opened our doors 10 years ago, including most of the Avengers movies, Man of Steel, Black Panther, Captain Marvel. We've done over 300 events like this one in real or virtual environments. And, you know, if you're a STEM professional and you're just learning that this program exists, this bridge between scientists and engineers and medical professionals and, you know, storytellers, we're always looking for more people to connect to Hollywood. So please do feel free to put up your hand and volunteer. We'd love to hear from you. So please contact us. Couple of points of order. I'd like to thank first our AV team, Ameche, for running the show. Thank you. We couldn't do it without you. Also, the office in DC, Courtney and Jeff, and of course, Sachi, my colleague here in Los Angeles. I would be remiss if I did not thank our sponsors like Howard Hughes Medical Institute, who actually gave us the money for this event here today and all of our events. We remain very grateful to them. Also, the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, Walt Disney Company, Film Nation, Google, the Lyda Hill Foundation, Corteva, and many individual donors like you. Some of you joined at our supporter level this week. Thank you so much for joining. We will be sending you one of these if you like it. And also, you will have access to our VIP Q&A session. Some of you also joined specifically at the VIP Q&A session. So you're going to have some FaceTime, some camera time with Bill Hallman after the event. So you'll get that extra time to ask questions directly. Thank you for your support. You know, I know not everybody can give right now. If you can give, it really goes right back into these events. So if you're enjoying the event, please consider doing that. So thank you very much. Little bit about today's event structure, right? And then, so there is a Q&A box down here. I see some of you have already discovered it. And you can ask a question at any time. And I will be grabbing as many questions as I possibly can. We've got a very limited time for Q&A, and we always have more questions than we have time for. My apologies. We try to get to as many as we humanly possibly can. And I will be feeding those questions to our moderator, Ahmed Best, who is the host of the Afrofuturist podcast and a senior fellow in communications and guest lecturer at USC Annenberg. I wrote that down. I was looking at my notes just to make sure I got that right. And we'll get to as many as we possibly can that way. So if you have a question, please put it in the chat below. I think that's it. Back to you, Anne.
Well, now it's time for I feel like there should be some music that we cue. The rabbit hole. I don't know. You're the guy that sources our music, so you're going to have to find some music for the rabbit hole.
Today's music, little intense.
Well, you know, you pick the music.
There you go.
I mean, come on.
Next time we'll go for some jazz or something.
Okay. All right. So for today's rabbit hole, I always start and then I kick it over to Rick. So I thought that part of the theme for today should incent me to go think about things that are a little disturbing or scary. And I remembered that one of the things that I read as a kid that really scared me was Shirley Jackson's The Lottery. And that was originally published, I think, in the New Yorker. And I went back and I listened to it on Audible. And it's still very disturbing. So if for those of you who haven't read The Lottery, it's very short, but it doesn't need to be longer to be disturbing. So I went back and listened to that. And then, and this was something that you gave me, Rick, this is a book called Death in the Middle by Betsy Isbell. Is that correct?
That's
and
right.
So it says on the back, something is very wrong in Oric, New York. So this is something I'm going to read because this is your aunt who wrote this, correct?
My aunt wrote this book, and so I read it, and I was commenting to Anne that it's very enjoyable. So I sent it to my boss.
Yeah, enjoyable in the scariest possible way. So I recommend that. And then this is sort of on theme. If spice scares you, and some people in my family, spice scares them. It's Manba. Spicy peanut butter, awesome. I know that you all wait for things from my pantry, and I received this in the mail because I think spicy peanut, I like spicy honey, so why not spicy peanut butter? And then I was reading about, I just sort of Googled scary things that can happen to you. Do you know that scary things that happen to people in their sleep? So apparently the person that you may sleep with in your bed, apparently it's fairly common to get punched in your sleep. like just people in their dream, not on purpose, like the person that could be dreaming just whacks off, punches you. Electrocution. Apparently they were charging their phone, and it was somebody that happens to wear a dog tag. They electrocuted themselves. I don't think they died, but they did get quite a shock. People driving into your house. They fall asleep at the wheel and they drive into your house. Somebody actually fell asleep at the wheel and drove into a gas station and blew up the gas station. Snakes crawl into your bed. That's not that uncommon. People have woken up and found animals, stray animals, raccoons, things like that in their house. That did not sound good to me. What were some of the other things? Most of them, there were some other weird things that can happen in your sleep, but apparently just going to sleep at night on an ordinary night, weird things can happen. And there are my dogs. I'm going to mute. You should talk about your rabbit.
Yeah. So my rabbit hole for this week, I got to recommend a documentary I saw on Netflix over the weekend called The Social Dilemma. I know I'm not the only one who's recommending this one, but it's definitely worth seeing. The other thing that I found on NASA's website that I thought was kind of cool, apparently, in NASA's own words, they have discovered a weird molecule on Titan. And in the article, it says you should not feel bad if you can't pronounce it, because a lot of folks at NASA stumble over it too. It's called cyclopropenyl iodine. I probably just totally murdered that. But and so they think this molecule on Titan, moon of Saturn, could be one of the building blocks of life. So of course, this being the Science and Entertainment Exchange, I called and saw I wanted to see if I could get like a picture of this building block of life on Titan. There you go. All right. Happy Halloween, everybody. Happy Halloween. And with that, Anne, have your dogs stopped barking?
Yes, they've now come to like jump on me. So we are very pleased for our science of risk perception. We got Bill Hallman, who has been on our stage before. He has attended some Science and Entertainment Exchange retreats. He's done other things, and I always email him. He can probably tell when I email him, it's sheepishly, because I know how often he does all the work that we ask him to do, generally at the academies. He is one of those people that is such a good soldier. By every time we ask him to volunteer and appear on the academy stage, generally around conference room tables at the institution, he always says yes. And it is true that at the academies, once we get our claws into you, like that little being behind you, Rick, it is really hard to get away. And I remember saying that to somebody who was new to the institution, and he laughed good-naturedly, and the other people sitting around the conference room table said, "Oh, she's not joking." And I think that Bill would agree. Yes, our claws are in you and it's hard to get away, but you're always so good-natured. And Bill has that very special quality of not only having all of the academic bona fides, but he's just really good at talking about the work that he does. So that's what makes him really great and why we all come after him. So thank you, Bill, for saying yes once again and agreeing to do the great work that you do. So thank you.
It is my pleasure always. So thanks for the invitation. So I thought I would start off talking a bit about who I am and what I do. And I know that in the materials that were sent out, I was outed as a psychologist, and so let's start there. Indeed, I am a psychologist. I have a degree in psychology from the University of South Carolina. But I need to emphasize that I am, in fact, not a clinical psychologist. I am not a psychotherapist. I don't deal with psychopathology at all. Indeed, I can barely deal with my own problems, let alone the problems of other people. And so I want to sort of raise this issue because normally when I'm in person, I get one of two reactions. Either people will make sure that they sit next to me at lunch or at dinner so that they can tell me about their psychological problems, the psychotropic drugs they're on, and the effects of those drugs, or they refuse to be anywhere near me, which is probably the safer thing, because they're concerned that I'm going to read their minds or somehow diagnose them as mentally unfit. So I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm not a therapist. I'm not a hypnotist, at least on purpose. Some of my students who have been in my lectures might disagree that I'm not a hypnotist. I'm just not one on purpose. I am, in fact, an experimental social psychologist. And that sometimes brings to mind people who work with rats and mazes. I need to assure you that I also don't work with animals. I work with much more dangerous and unpredictable subjects, that is, people. So what I do is I study risk perception and risk communication. What I look at is, or what I study is how people see, how they think about and talk about risks in their daily lives. Fundamentally, my work involves helping people understand and respond to risks to human health and the environment, as individuals, as citizens, and as policymakers. It's important to note that much of the work I do is on applied problems. And most of the work that I do is with other scientists, bench scientists, social scientists. Nearly all the work I do is interdisciplinary. So I end up working with lots and lots of interesting people on lots of different kinds of problems. So I've worked on a number of public health topics, including things like food insecurity among older Americans, college students, and low resource families. I've done a great deal of work on food safety issues, including food recalls and foodborne illness outbreaks. Some really interesting work in Southeast Asia on foodborne parasites. I've done work on infectious diseases, including how people think about and respond to the threat of Zika virus and Lyme disease and influenza. I've done some work on non-communicable diseases like cancer and lead poisoning, some work on preventive health behaviors and including vaccination and safe food handling practices. I did some early work on what are referred to as unexplained symptom syndromes, including things like multiple chemical sensitivities, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, and Gulf War syndrome. I've done a lot of work on environmental topics, including climate issues, climate adaptation, mitigation, coastal storm warnings, contamination issues, environmental topics, air quality, plastic debris in water, arsenic in rice, mercury in seafood, and a fair amount of work on how people think about new technologies. So I've had a fairly long career looking at how people think about GMOs, or genetically modified organisms. And now gene editing. I've looked at animal cloning, nanotechnology, and lots of other applied issues. And one of the things that is really apparent is that we don't always worry about the right risks. We tend to worry about new and unfamiliar risks. And while we're worrying about those new and unfamiliar risks, we tend to forget about familiar ongoing risks. So while we're worried about COVID, and we should be taking actions, we should be washing our hands and wearing masks and practicing social distancing, we can't forget about the other kinds of things that kind of pick us off. So, we need to continue vaccinating against influenza. We need to be vaccinating our kids. We need to be following a proper diet and exercising and driving safely when we do that. We tend to focus on risks that are particularly dreadful consequences, regardless of how likely they are to happen. So things, dying suddenly and gruesomely tends to occupy our minds, as opposed to slowly of things like obesity. And we tend to worry about risks that we're exposed to involuntarily or are outside of our control. We tend to think that the things which are imposed on us are a lot more risky than the things we're actually in control of ourselves. I also, after about 30 years, realized that most of the things that I work on, and in fact, most of the risks people worry about, are indeed invisible. And so I've come to see my job as a psychologist working on risk perception and risk communication is to make the invisible visible, even to those people who would prefer not to see, and in ways that get people to take action. And the common thread in all of this is that nearly all of my work involves talking with the public and policymakers about topics involving risk, health, and science. And so I'm really looking forward to the conversation this afternoon. I hope you will ask me good questions.
Hey, Bill.
Hey,
how are you?
I'm dandy.
Good. It's good to hear. Hi, everyone out there in Science Land. My name is Ahmed Best, and as Rick said earlier, I am a senior fellow at the Annenberg School of Communications at USC. I am an adjunct lecturer at the School of Dramatic Arts. I am an actor. I am a futurist. I'm a writer. I'm a director. I'm a storyteller. I played Jar Jar Binks in Star Wars. I'm just going to get that out of the way. Don't ask me any questions about that because this is all about Bill. And I think, and I'm gonna just jump right in because there's a lot that I want to talk about, and I'm so incredibly excited about this conversation as someone who prides himself on taking risks. So I think what you and I do are very, very similar, and there are a lot of similarities between what you and I do. You think about how people think about things, right? And then you talk about their behavior, and I behave the way people think about things, right? As an actor, that's my job to just get the behavior. And so I really like to ingest those ideas and be able to act in them in that way, which brings me to a whole bunch of topics. But before we talk about that, I would like to ask you and start with this idea of happy cows. Why is it that the idea of happy cows makes us as consumers want to buy happy cow cheese, right? And we're talking about how we are marketed to when it comes to our food. And you kind of dove into it when you started talking about GMOs. So what is it in us that makes us want to buy happy cow cheese?
Well, it's not just happy cow cheese either. One of the things that's been really interesting to me, so I gave this sort of litany of the kinds of issues I've dealt with over the years. It's really interesting that people's perceptions of the food that they eat and their perceptions of the risks associated with those foods are really different than the other kinds of risks that they deal with in everyday life. So there's something really unique about food that makes it really, really different. And if you think about it, there are lots of differences. One is that you're familiar with the old adage, "You are what you eat."
Yes.
And so the act of actually ingesting something, it becomes part of you, both sort of physically and spiritually. And so we tend to pay attention to the kinds of things that we put in our body. What's interesting about that is that we don't pay similar attention to the kinds of drugs that we take, which we also ingest, except that those things are supposed to have kind of magical properties and they're supposed to have an impact on us. Many people would argue that food is a drug, or foods are drugs. They keep us healthy. But we think about foods really, really differently. There are lots of cultural issues related to food that aren't present in lots of the other risks that we tend to face during the day. We tend to use food to form bonds with each other. If you want to get to know somebody, you take them out to dinner, or you have a snack with them or whatever. We use food in a lot of ways to maintain those bonds. So one of the really depressing things this year is not being able to go to Thanksgiving dinner. With your loved ones. So we use food in a lot of different ways beyond kind of the normal. So what is it about cheese from happy cows? And for those of you not from California, you may not know what Ahmed is referring to. I think the California Dairy Board had or still has an ad campaign that says the best cheese comes from happy cows, or the happiest cows. And if you see the advertisements, the print advertisement, I actually show this in my class. It's really interesting that you bring this up. there is a picture of a cow with a very large grin that looks like that of your great aunt who's about to kiss you on Easter. It's just a little unsettling. So I don't know why they chose that particular image. But we care a lot about our food and where it comes from in ways that we don't really think about in terms of other risks. So the best cheese comes from happy cows. Oh, great. Well, now I have to worry about how happy my cow is. Just another thing for me to kind of worry about. So
right, this idea of the mental stability and health of bovine influences you into buying things, and I think it goes along the lines of what you're talking about perception, right? Rather than facts, right? Perception is what we believe. Facts are very difficult to actually communicate to people whether you need them or not, because perception, and I've seen and read a bunch of things from you. You talk about how perception is reality, and just as the science communicator, and I would love for you to put on the science communicator hat for this idea of perception. I look at science not as a discipline, but as a method, right? The way you do things in a scientific way, rather than science being this thing that only a certain amount of people know. So when it comes to science communication, do scientists and does science, and I consider myself kind of a hobbyist scientist, but does science and do scientists suffer from a public relations problem? Science is always looked at as something elitist, right? It's looked at something that only those people who can afford that type of schooling can only take. However, the method of science is something kind of inherent in every human being, right? So as a science communicator, is science suffering from a problem of publicity?
No question. No question. And as much as I like the Big Bang Theory, really, did you have to portray scientists, as nerds? Many of us
Right.
have worked all our lives to try and break that stereotype. Yeah, we have a PR problem very, very often. And, beyond what the public thinks about scientists, I think the bigger issue is frankly the way that we actually teach science in school. That often we teach science as a series of facts, and we test people on those series of facts. And we'll do polls about what percentage of the population thinks that the Earth revolves around the sun, or the sun revolves around the Earth, and we kind of collect when the percentage of the large percentage of the population that doesn't get that right. But science is not about a set of facts. It's really a way that we know how what things are true, how we can create testable hypotheses, and how that information or how our best information changes over time. It's a process. And yet we tend to teach kids about science as if it is that there is a great discovery. There's a sort of the great man or great woman scientist who falls asleep and wakes up one morning having dreamt about a snake biting its tail, and that's how we figure out molecular chemistry, and this sort of hero thing, as opposed to the difficult slog that science actually is. And by teaching people about amazing discoveries and thinking about particular facts, we often turn kids off. Often we teach them that science is not for them, that we kind of kill their natural curiosity. Now, not everybody, there are lots of really good science curricula which try to keep that natural inquisitiveness alive. But we need more of that. The National Academies is certainly pushing for that. And I'll say, this is part of my rant, sorry. Even in college, when we teach students about science and chemistry and biology, often students have to take, an intro class, an intro to chemistry or intro to bio class. And most of those classes are set up with the expectation that if you take Bio 101, you're going to take Bio 102, and then 103 and 104 or 105, as opposed to teaching you critical thinking skills about biology, critical information that's actually going to be useful to you. And honestly, the most useful thing you could teach somebody is how to find new information about science as it evolves. Most of us give up formal education in science after high school. Most of us don't even go to college, and most of us who go to college don't major in science.
Yeah, what is it? A third of Americans have a bachelor's degree or something to that effect?
Yeah, and only about 10% have a degree kind of in the STEM field.
In the sciences, right?
Right. So we need to be teaching people how to be lifelong learners about science and to be open to science, as opposed to saying, "Well, that's just too difficult for me. That's not for me. That's for other people," and get their information from social media. So.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna piggyback on that with a question from our chat, as well as talking about the elephant in the room, which is COVID-19 and the vaccine and the risk behind the COVID-19 vaccine, right? And you're talking about science literacy and having science literacy be this thing that kind of everybody has, and not the expertise in a field, but the critical thinking that science literacy gives you, right? So as far as risk goes, especially with vaccinations and vaccine, does that lack of science literacy, does that lend itself to the fear of vaccinations in general, especially the COVID vaccine? And does the fact that the folks who we are supposed to trust when it comes to vaccines don't persuade us in a way that makes us trust them?
So, wow, there are lots of parts of that question. I would say, yeah, so COVID vaccine is the elephant in the room. And I've said in a lot of other venues that the vaccine will only be effective if people are willing to take it. And so people's mistrust in the scientific process that brought us the vaccine, or the kind of potential political influence that people believe may be behind that. I don't particularly believe it myself. Gets in the way. We should be clear as scientists that simply trying to explain the facts about the vaccine, louder or clearer, or giving people pictures, that isn't going to necessarily change people's minds. Yeah, facts are important. We need to do that, but that's probably not going to be enough to persuade people to take the vaccine. There are lots of other things that we need to do. We need to be leading by example, although I was asked yesterday whether having the governor of New Jersey be publicly vaccinated would convince people to be vaccinated in the state of New Jersey. I'm like, I don't think so.
Yeah, no.
And why? Well, first of all, I mentioned this to my students last night, and one of them was saying, in my neck of the woods, they wouldn't be convinced that he was actually getting the vaccine. They would think he's getting saline solution. Yeah. And others said, oh, well, but if he got vaccinated and anything went wrong, he's a rich guy, he's the governor of New Jersey, and he would be taken care of. It's kind of like the president, taking the personal helicopter to Walter Reed.
Walter Reed, yeah.
We don't all have that kind of plan B backup plan. But I do think that, that leading by example, those of us who understand that it will only work if enough of us get vaccinated, are willing to go ahead and do that, and to bring others along with us. I think that's kind of the way to lead on this.
What is the invisible thing that terrifies us so much about this vaccine? What is it about human beings that go, you know what? No, I just don't. Even though the science is there, vaccines have been around for a very long time. They've eliminated many of the infectious diseases that existed on the planet to extinction. Why is it that we in this country are still terrified of vaccines?
So I think we need to be careful not to overstate that. The majority of the population is getting vaccinated. We are vaccinating our kids against childhood diseases. And thank God for that, because without that, we would have a resurgence of, many of the diseases that killed us, 60 years ago. Without that, we are extraordinarily vulnerable. There is a smaller group of Americans who are hesitant about vaccines. It doesn't mean that they will never get a vaccine. They will delay getting a vaccine. I think that's the case with some people around COVID-19. They'll say, yeah, I will get it, but you first, or I want to see others I know get it and make sure that they're okay. So there's a lot of that going on. What's interesting for me is the idea that somehow getting the disease would be better than getting the vaccine.
Yeah, that's very interesting to me as well.
And somehow getting a dose of the COVID virus, you don't know how much of a dose naturally versus getting a controlled dose that has been experimentally shown to be effective and not harmful. Why is sort of the natural infection or the risk of a natural infection better or more acceptable than getting vaccinated?
Yeah.
Part of it, I think, has to do, we've known a long time in the risk field that people are much more skeptical of things which are made by human beings than the natural. There has been, unfortunately, skepticism created by the political nature of this, the sense that perhaps the vaccine has been rushed for political purposes. And that has done a lot to undermine things. So there's a skepticism over about the motivation of the companies that are involved in this. And that, that's true of some of the childhood vaccinations as well. So, why are they telling us we need to do it? Is it because it's good for us or because it's good for them? It's good for their profits. So it's not simply saying it's safe, go ahead and get it. It's addressing a lot of these other issues which get to values that are really kind of outside science.
Right. I'm going to ask this question from the chat, and I'm actually going to frame it in a couple of different ways. Audrey asks, after a near-death experience in a car accident, she's been fearful of driving. Any suggestions on how you can get over this type of fear of risk? But just to take it one step further anecdotally, how do you frame risk in your life, being a risk expert? And how do you separate the anecdotal risk from the general risk?
So that's a really good question. So I introduced myself as an experimental psychologist. I am a scientist. Most of the work I do is actually empirical. I do a lot of work on statistics. I know what the statistical risks are. It makes me really boring in Las Vegas or in Atlantic City because I know what the odds are. And so I don't play the games. I was taken to the track once and placed a $2 bet and won $38. And that's the last bet I've ever placed because I figured I was ahead. I should quit on that. So how do I deal with risk? I look at the probabilities. I look at the things that I can control on my own. I try not to worry about the things that I have no control over. But we should also say, one of the elephants in the room here as well, I am the elephant in the room. So I am a well-educated, older white male, fat and happy and living in New Jersey. I've kind of won the lottery already, there are a lot of things I don't have to worry about because of where I am and what I do and who my parents were. So there are lots of other things that people legitimately have to worry about that I don't have to worry about.
Right. And so when you're looking at someone who's coming to you from a perspective of, I was in a car accident, I can't drive. How do you approach them when you're talking about empirical evidence when it comes to what you do and what you come to when it comes to risk?
Right. So this happens to a lot of people. They have something dramatic happen to them, and they naturally want to avoid being in a similar situation. When I was a kid, I was bitten by a dog, and it took me a long, long time to actually have a dog in my house, because I just wanted to avoid the pain of that. My wife says, that explains a lot about me, that she would not have married me if she'd known that I had this thing about dogs. And yet she did, and we have a golden retriever somewhere in the background here. Part of what a therapist would tell you to do is to kind of do a desensitization training. Again, I'm not a psychotherapist, but to slowly re-enter into the activities that caused you to have this anxiety, and to desensitize yourself of that. There are lots of people who are afraid of flying, for example, and that's exactly the way that that many people can deal with that. But it's not easy. It really is not easy. So you need to do it little by little.
Right. I would love to talk about conspiracy theories for a little bit, because it's really pervasive in the time that we're in right now, and especially during this election, but they didn't come from nowhere. I think the difference between now and 50 years ago is the dissemination of information is so fast, and the ability for that information to look truthful and look empirical. I always say one of the genius moves behind Fox News is the fact that they say, we look just like them and we're lying to you. What makes you think that they're not lying to you, right? So this idea of conspiracy theories, what makes us believe the little bit of truth in a conspiracy theory and then dive all of it?
So that actually opens up a larger question about misinformation and news which is not accurate, not just conspiracies, which are about kind of the motivations of people, just things which are just not true. They're just outright lies. One of the things that we need to really pay attention to is that there are far too many lies out there for any one person to try to deal with on their own.
Yes.
There are ways that we can teach our students and our kids how to recognize lies. We need to do that, but we can't simply go through and fact check everything. It's just too exhausting. So one of the questions is, what do we pay attention to? What do we fact check? What do we deal with? And I say that there are really two issues that are fundamental. One is who the liar is. So what's the influence, the potential influence of the liar? And secondly is, what's the plausibility of the lie? Just as you were saying, if it sounds true, first day of psychology at University of South Carolina, one of my professors said, perception is reality. It doesn't really matter what the science says or what the truth is. You're going to act depending on what you think the truth is. So perception is reality. So if it sounds true, and you don't have a lot of background yourself to say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't make sense to me, then you're likely to buy into it, particularly if it connects to something that you already believe or to your identity. So, one of the things that we really need to pay attention to is not just the individual lies, but kind of the network of lies that form a kind of mental model or an approach to the way that people think about the world in general. And that's where we've gotten into a lot of trouble with respect to misinformation and conspiracy theories.
Yeah, and I think I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about climate change here, right?
Yeah.
Because there's a large group of people who are trying to gaslight those of us who who know with empirical evidence that human beings are changing the climate, right? But you run into this cabal of people who don't believe climate change exists. And this is when we run into the fact versus perception problem, right? Like, as many facts as there are out there for climate change, it doesn't matter to these people, right? It doesn't matter to those who do not believe it exists. And we're arguing, I believe, the wrong thing when it comes to climate change. The argument isn't it exists, it doesn't exist. The argument is it exists, how do we deal with it, right? So when we're talking about climate change, and we're talking about this idea of fear and this gaslighting, two questions. How do we deal with that as people who know climate change exists? And then how do we persuade those who don't believe it exists into recognizing what is actually happening with the empirical evidence?
You don't ask me easy questions, Ahmed.
It's not my job. I don't know these things.
You have the job here. So, you know, one of the things that we know in persuasive communications, not just risk communication, is that you can't persuade everybody, and you shouldn't have that as your goal. The trick is not to try to get the hardliners to necessarily change their minds, to flip, you know, their opinions, because good luck on that. What you need to be able to do is to reach people who have not yet made up their minds. And one of the ways to do that is to stop bludgeoning them with facts, but rather to start with values. What do we both care about? What's worth protecting? What's worth us, you know, getting together to deal with for the future? Because this, you know, climate change is now, but we're really seeing the major impacts for our kids and our grandkids.
Yes.
So let's start with that, as opposed to the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. Yeah, that's important, but that's not very persuasive to normal human beings at this point. So let's start there.
So it's very easy to fall into the factual when it comes to that kind of stuff, right? Because you're just like, we're ruining it for our kids and grandkids. And they'll go, well, how? And you're like, the amount of carbon that we're putting, all of a sudden we're in like science land, right? And that's when they just shut off. How do we find that common ground? How do we find that commonality? What do you think are maybe questions we can ask, walks we can take, pictures we can show that don't all of a sudden, and I think this kind of goes back to the science public relation problem, right? We really don't have that science education as a foundation, as a populace, for us to be able to take these algorithmic steps to getting to here it is, right? So where is that common ground? What do we start with and how do we move through the value system, right? To get them to stop, to get them to start maybe thinking about what we're saying.
So again, you don't ask me easy questions. Let me begin with we need to be careful in how we frame how other people see climate change. So full disclosure, I am a member of the advisory committee to the Climate Communications Initiative at the National Academy of Sciences. So I think a lot about how to communicate about climate issues. One of the things we need to stop doing is assuming that anybody who doesn't buy the science or who doesn't buy the facts that we're giving them are stupid. We get nowhere essentially saying, you know, what's wrong with you? Why can't you see what I can clearly see? That gets you nowhere at all. And you know, the problem that we face is that, well, so again, one of my rants, my students are familiar with this. The question is, can the public actually, you know, make a good decision? Can they reach the right decision? And the question is, what's your definition of the right decision? Is it the decision I've already made as an expert? Maybe not. And the question then is, well, if they don't reach the same decision you have made as an expert, well, what does that mean? So, you know, we tend to have conversations with people who are our friends, who think a lot like us, who know many of the same things that we do. And, you know, that's one of the reasons that we're friends with them. So we tend to be in this kind of bubble of folks who know things we know and think like we do. And so it's easy to have a conversation with them. And we all sort of get to the same point. This is exacerbated, in fact, by the scientific method. So when I go to publish a paper, I lay out my assumptions, I lay out my methods, I lay out my results, I lay out the implications of those results. If you as another scientist don't agree with what I found or the conclusions I've reached, we go back to the top and we look at the assumptions that I have made and we say, okay, well, do we agree on the assumptions? And so we sort of go through this process. We don't necessarily do that in real life. The problem then becomes, if you reach a different decision than I reach, Ahmed, about a particular issue, I conclude that something is wrong with you.
Right.
Because I'm clearly smart and I reached this particular decision. You didn't reach the same endpoint. So therefore, something's wrong with you, either intellectually or in terms of motivation. You're somehow bought off, which then brings us around to the conspiracy theory issue. It's not about the facts, it's about motivation.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's along those same lines, because what we're talking about is my fear of your fear, right? And my thinking that because I have the information, my fear holds more value than your fear does without the information, right? I think that's what we're talking about when we're talking about these two things, right?
Yeah.
The people who believe that climate change doesn't exist are strong in their belief, as strong as the people who have the empirical evidence, right? So when those two fears start coming together, right, and you get to this impasse, where do you go? How do you get to dispassionate, let's find this common ground?
So one of the approaches that I take on a personal level is essentially is again starting with values. What do we both agree on? And then I go to, well, what's the cost of being wrong? So I believe that climate change is anthropocentric, that we are behind this. Well, what's the cost of me being wrong? Well, the cost of me being wrong is that we put more into sustainable energy sources. We insulate our homes. We recreate an economy around more sustainable sources of energy and lower emissions. And that would have knock-on effects. That would have also beneficial effects. There are those who would argue that it would have financial and economic consequences that we may have to deal with. But then I turn around and say, okay, well, what if you're wrong? So if it's not anthropocentric, if climate change is not real, then potentially we have an existential threat. We lose species. We have flooding along the coasts, along rivers. We have all these sort of dramatic impacts. So let's talk about the cost of being wrong. I'm willing.
That is a great tool. That is fantastic.
Okay, so I've earned my money today.
Yes, absolutely. Because that is a really good piece. A lot of the times when we're having these conversations, we just reach this impasse, right? Yeah. And it could be with your family members. It can be with your best friends. It can even be with your spouse. But that tool of what the cost of being wrong is, like, on the one hand, the cost of my being wrong is we can develop brand new technologies and economies that make us better. That's cool. The cost of you being wrong is no more planet, right?
Right.
Let's just weigh those things. Right. I think that's a brilliant tool. We don't have a lot of time left, but because I'm a futurist, I'd like to talk about the future just a little bit.
Sure.
And I'm gonna couple it with Philip's question, which is, why do we overestimate the possibility of the most harmful events outcomes occurring? I personally call this precognitive prognostication, right? Why do we always assume that what's going to happen is bad, right? What is it about us that looks at the dystopian and attracts us, not just looks at it, but attracts us to dystopian? And if we're talking about like narrative fiction, the biggest one is AI, talking about the Terminator. Every time somebody says, oh man, Google is doing AI, the next thing you know, it's like Skynet and Arnold Schwarzenegger brother is going to come down and take everybody out, right? So what is it about the future that gives us the anxieties?
It's the uncertainty, very clearly. The inability to have control over what's going to happen is what's unsettling for most of us. It's being out of control. It's having things happen to us. And one of the things we've not talked about is how we kind of get through that, how we navigate that.
Yes.
In fact, I don't think we're all quite as pessimistic that we all think that something bad is going to really happen to us. In fact, most of us walk around in a state of what's referred to as unrealistic optimism. We tend to think that bad things happen to other people. And there's a corollary to this, which is called the just world hypothesis, which is that bad things happen to other people for a reason, like they deserve it.
Yes. Yeah.
And so as long as we remain good people, then bad things will not happen to me. And so we walk around with this unrealistic optimism, not paying attention to some of the risks that perhaps we ought to be paying attention to, because we think they happen to other people, not to us.
So what are those risks that we should put a little bit more emphasis on in our lives?
It's the things that we don't want to do. It's the hard things. We're all really concerned about dying dramatically, I think.
Yeah.
When it's the slow killers that we really need to pay attention to. If you look at the most frequent or the most probable cause of death, how is it that you're going to die in the future? It's not going to be in a plane crash.
Right.
It's probably going to be cancer or cardiovascular disease or lots of other things which are impacted by lifestyle. But changing your lifestyle is hard. It's boring. There's no pleasure in it. And so sometimes we get distracted by these other bigger things that are out there, and we fail to pay attention to the everyday kinds of things that would make us live longer and happier and better.
Well, I think that is a wonderful way to wrap this conversation up, Bill. This has been an absolute pleasure. I think we got to half my stuff. I think I can talk about this kind of stuff like all day long. I'm so appreciative of your time, your expertise. I've learned a lot. I think I've gotten one of the most important tools for climate change discussions that I think I've gotten ever. But this was just an absolute pleasure, and it was an absolute joy. Thank you very much for allowing me to ask you a bunch of questions. Ann and Rick, thank you for having me. I really, really appreciate you. And I'm going to turn it back over to our hosts. Thank you so much.
Listen, we appreciate both of you. And when we were thinking about the two people we wanted to put together, we knew that this conversation would go just the way it did, because we know that Bill is so good at answering questions and you are so good at asking them. The perfect combination.
There's a lot I don't know. I really appreciate not knowing a lot of things and having access to people who know a lot more than me.
Well, and you're just a naturally curious person, and you don't mind asking about things that you don't know about. And that's great. Right. And Bill, during the event, I received a Slack message from a colleague who said, not only is Bill a good egg, he's the best egg. And so your reputation around the academies is well-deserved. We all think that you're great. And now I think that our bigger audience understands why that is so, because we so very much appreciate the two of you and the fact that you do say yes when we call upon you. And I will continue to be sheepish when I send you the emails, because I know that your time is valuable and that we presume upon it an awful lot. But I think you can see why, because this was a great conversation. And
yeah, it was fantastic.
But wait, there's more for some.
There's more.
Yes, we have another half hour with Bill and Ahmed on.
Yes.
If you donated, or if you are a coin holder, then you got you got a Zoom link from us, and we will continue the conversation for 30 minutes over there. And you'll have a chance to ask your questions of Bill and Ahmed over there. So please don't.
That's right.
Click.
So when we do that, this is the way, because we always, as Rick said, we get more questions than we can possibly accommodate, but this is how we accommodate more questions. So when these opportunities do come up, we highly suggest that you take advantage of them. I also want to say that we're not doing an event next week. We know there's a lot going on next week. So we're not going to presume on anyone's time. We do expect to come back the week afterwards, and we're having a very special conversation that is based on the work of our Committee on Human Rights, and we'll be having a conversation with two scientists that have experienced ways in which their work is marginalized because they have been imperiled. Well, actually, one is a journalist who really connects with scientists who have been actually too much at risk to be able to come on camera and talk about their experiences, but she can talk about that work. And then another scientist who has experienced this directly. And we hope that the chair of the Committee on Human Rights will be able to moderate that conversation. We're probably going to shift the time a little bit to be able to accommodate the people that will be part of this conversation because they are not in the United States. So look for more about that as we confirm their participation. But as I say, next week is a bye week. And so go out, go vote. And
Yes.
That's right. And
Please don't forget to vote.
That's right. It's sort of like get your flu shot, go vote. So we'll see you in 2 weeks.
See you in 2 weeks, everybody.
Thank you for being here. Bye.